And now I want to talk about the cows. Those farmers, all 48% of them, skewed the data, and I just wanted to explain how I figured this out. By looking at one of the questions where I actually asked the farmers if they had ever lied, or, if they had ever, this question asked specifically about manure, and if they'd ever broken laws concerning that. And obviously, those with a lot of cattle have a lot of cow poo to deal with, and so they're probably going to be less likely to be able to 100% of the time comply with environmental regulations, because they are very, very strict. And so there is a strongly negative correlation with those who produce cows with non-compliance of this specific type of compliance. And so when I was looking at the overall model, I was trying to combine all of my questions in a way, but I wasn't able to do this. And so I also took other questions that didn't ask specifically if they'd ever broken the law, but that measured their willingness to comply with the law. It's a more sneaky way of trying to measure something that people would probably lie on anyway. And I called that variable willingness to comply, and it'll be in these tables that are going to start showing up now. When people talk about sustainability, oftentimes, like even in late night discussions with friends, you might come up with the conclusion that, well, all the environmental problems in the world, it's a generational thing. All of us are much more environmentally aware and engaged, and once the other generations aren't in charge anymore, things will be different. But that isn't necessarily the case, at least for Norwegian farmers. There is actually even a positive relationship between age of the farmer and willingness to comply, although it's not significant. But looking at this data even further on the scatter plot, there isn't necessarily any sort of cohort, as it's called, of a generation, a generation that is acting different from everyone else. It's actually pretty regularly scattered. So there's nothing really to glean from here. But now, this is the linear regression analysis, and this is a little bit intimidating for anyone that hasn't done SPSS, but I'll try and break it down as simply as possible for you guys. First of all, if you look here at the R-square value, that is at almost 0.2, which isn't necessarily the best, if you know what this means. I know that. But what it does explain is that of the independent variables affecting the dependent variable, for this being willingness to comply with environmental policy, 20% of the variation in the dependent variable is accounted for. So all of these other things account for 20% of the decision process of complying with environmental regulations. And the independent variables that have become significant here are, one of them is called agricultural network density. Basically measures how many of your buddies are farmers, basically. How dense is your network in terms of primary or only farmers? And so there's actually a negative relationship with that. So, and that was highly significant. So what that means basically is if you're hanging out with farmers all day long, you're less likely to comply with environmental regulations, which is kind of counterintuitive if you think about it. But I'll explain that a little bit further in a little bit. The second one is just looking at trust levels in the government. And that was a positive, significant relationship, which is what I thought would happen considering Tyler's work and that stuff. The third one isn't significant, but I thought it would be interesting to include. I the farmers for their what party they most identify strongly with, and those who identify most strongly with the Progress Party are less likely to comply with environmental regulation, which, if you know Norwegian politics at all, makes a lot of sense, because the Progress Party is very classically liberal in a lot of ways. They are they're very supportive of George Bush, we'll put it that way. And they're very critical of the welfare state and the amount of taxes that Norway has and the size of Norway's bureaucracy in general. And so it makes sense that they would not be complying with environmental regulations of a bureaucracy that they think shouldn't even exist. Yeah. What's also interesting is I included age here, and that actually turned out to be significant once it was added in with all the other variables, but it's still a very slightly positive relationship. So again, it's not probably a generational thing, probably just some sort of small age effect where as you grow older, you realize that you need to farm in a way that you can keep the land going after you're not farming anymore. And then this last one here, sustained ag def 2, was not significant at all, which is this variable that I showed you here. I came up with the new scale by myself. It didn't fit into the model at all, which was kind of a bummer, but that is kind of how social science research goes sometimes. And then I have another little interesting thing about the model. If you look back here at the first linear regression analysis, you see that the agricultural network density is it's significant and has a negative relationship. But then if we add in another important variable that I labeled morality, those farmers who consider its moral as being the most important reason for complying with environmental regulation versus those who don't, it's significant and it has a positive relationship. But then if you look back up at agricultural network densities, this becomes insignificant now. In political science, that's what would be called a mediating variable. And I have a little graphical to show you this visually, because it's much easier to understand that way. So you have agricultural network density with a significant negative relationship affecting the willingness to comply, and then when you add in moral judgments, this becomes insignificant, and there are the moral considerations change this relationship to become positive. So, what does this all mean, I guess? To reiterate, it's not a generational thing. There's probably just a slight age effect. I already explained that. Trust in government is important, but I found that general trust and trust in other farmers isn't important to this model, which makes sense, but isn't necessarily what my theoretical model was looking at. So maybe it may have been that the questions didn't necessarily translate in a way that it was measuring general trust and trust in other farmers, or some other reason. Also, views of sustainable agriculture don't necessarily matter for this model, at least yet. I'm continuing on with the survey and keeping it open and still inviting farmers to come and participate in it. And hopefully, maybe I'll start to, I'll recategorize it in a way that it will hopefully form a significant relationship. And what else? I wanted to talk more about this whole moral considerations thing, because it's morality affecting network density, which is more of a societal behavior versus an individual behavior. And a normative behavior at that. It's not a self-interested one. When you're considering the morals of complying with the law, you're not thinking about your own self-gain necessarily. You're thinking about what's best for society. And so in a lot of literature nowadays, especially in environmental and agriculture economics, it's basically assumed that farming behavior acts in a way that is primarily self-interested, and that moral consideration shouldn't be considered at all because they aren't very important. But this isn't necessarily the case. My research does find that moral considerations are significant and they should be considered a part of the model. So my findings beg to differ with that healthy wide assumption. And so overall, the theoretical model didn't necessarily work in some ways, but that's probably because of the a lot of variability that still hasn't been accounted for with other variables that are part of a very complex model that my model is trying to simplify to a point that it can only go so far. And there's also a couple other challenges to the survey, including that, you know, it's hard to translate something so that it means literally the same thing in another language and then try and take those results of that other language and translate them back into English. There's some methodology issues there. And also you have respondents' honesty. I mean, I was asking these guys, have you ever lied on your yearly environmental input reports? And so, I mean, I was talking to my environmental econ professor about these types of questions, and she said, well, you're basically asking them if they killed their baby. And in a lot of ways that's true. These guys don't want to get in trouble, obviously, and even though it is an anonymous survey, it's over the internet with some random American student that they've never heard of, like, they don't necessarily trust the survey, right? And so what's going on in the future? The survey is still open. As of now, I have about 130 respondents. I'm hoping to send out another email in the future that will remind them to do the survey, and hopefully that will create a jump in my number of respondents sometime. And I'll continue examining the data for other interesting relationships or other ways that I can improve the model or manipulate the data that I have to look at other things. And I may eventually submit these results for an undergraduate research conference. We'll see. I've been working really, really hard this semester and kind of want to take a break, but you never know. And just in general, I'd like to point out that future research should focus on testing different methods of survey questions. And I think that is it, unless anyone has any questions for me. No? All right. Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you for listening.